The words hit me like a slap across the face, even though I should have expected them by now. My brother Derek stood in the middle of his pristine kitchen, designer suit perfectly pressed, gesturing dismissively at my uniform as I tied my apron strings. "Come on, Sarah. You're just a waitress. What could you possibly know about planning a wedding that costs more than you make in 5 years?" His fiancée Madison giggled from her perch on the marble countertop, her engagement ring catching the light from the chandelier above. She was everything Derek thought he deserved: blonde, beautiful, and born into the kind of money that made people forget to tip their servers. "Derek's right, honey," she said in that saccharine voice that made my teeth ache. "Wedding planning requires a certain level of sophistication. Maybe you could help with something more appropriate for your skill set? Like serving drinks at the rehearsal dinner?" I forced a smile and continued tying my apron, the black fabric worn soft from years of 12-hour shifts at Romano's, the upscale Italian restaurant downtown. I was just offering to help since I've been in the service industry for 15 years. I know a thing or two about what makes events run smoothly. Derek laughed, the sound sharp and condescending. "Carrying plates and taking orders isn't the same as coordinating vendors and managing a budget of $200,000, Sarah. Stick to what you know." $200,000. He said it like it was an impossible sum, like I couldn't possibly comprehend that level of expense. If only he knew that I'd spent more than that on a single wine acquisition just last month. "Right," I said quietly, picking up my car keys from his granite countertop. "Well, I should get to work. These plates won't carry themselves." As I drove to Romano's in my 10-year-old Honda Civic, I thought about the irony of my situation. Derek lived in his glass house in the suburbs, working as a mid-level marketing executive, completely oblivious to the fact that his, quote, just a waitress sister owned the very restaurant where she still chose to work. The truth was complicated, and I'd never bothered to correct his assumptions. 15 years ago, I'd started as a server at Romano's, working double shifts to pay for business classes at the community college. Antonio Romano, the elderly owner, had taken me under his wing, teaching me about wine, food cost management, and the intricate dance of running a successful restaurant. When Antonio's health began failing 5 years ago, he'd offered to sell me the restaurant for a fraction of its market value. "You understand this place," he'd said, his weathered hands shaking as he signed the papers. "You know every customer, every supplier, every waiter's dream. Promise me you'll keep the soul of this place alive." I'd used my savings, taken out loans, and worked 18-hour days to make the payments. But Romano's wasn't just profitable. It was thriving. We'd expanded to 3 locations, developed a catering business that served some of the city's most exclusive events, and I'd personally built relationships with wine distributors that gave us access to bottles worth more than Derek's annual salary. The staff didn't know I was the owner. I'd kept Antonio's name on everything, preferring to work alongside my employees rather than manage from an office. To them, I was Sarah, the head server who somehow had input on scheduling and vendor decisions. To my family, I was Sarah, the waitress who couldn't possibly understand their sophisticated world. Tonight was particularly busy, with a corporate dinner for 60 and 3 private parties in our event spaces. I moved through the dining room with practiced efficiency, taking orders and making recommendations, all while mentally reviewing profit margins and planning next month's wine tastings. "Sarah?" called out James Morrison, one of our regular customers and the city's most sought-after wedding photographer. "I need to talk to you about the Henderson wedding next month. They want to add a champagne tower, and I'm not sure our usual caterer can handle the logistics." I paused, balancing 3 plates on my arm. The Henderson wedding was one of our biggest catering contracts this year, a $50,000 event that would showcase Romano's capabilities to the city's social elite. "Let's discuss it after service," I said quietly. "I have some ideas about how to make it work." James nodded, accustomed to my behind-the-scenes involvement in the restaurant's operations. He'd been photographing our events for years and had witnessed my gradual transition from server to silent partner to owner, though he was one of the few who knew the full story. The evening rush continued until nearly midnight, when the last customers finally headed home and the staff began their closing routines. I helped with the final cleanup, counted the till, and reviewed tomorrow's reservations before heading to my real office in the basement. The contrast was jarring. Downstairs, away from the rustic charm of the dining room, was a fully equipped business center with computers, filing cabinets, and wall-mounted monitors, showing real-time sales data from all 3 locations. This was where I planned menus, negotiated with suppliers, and managed the financial empire I'd built one table at a time. I pulled up Derek's wedding details on my computer. Madison's father was hosting the reception at the Grandview Country Club, and I knew the catering manager there. A few phone calls had given me all the information I needed. The menu, the guest count, the timeline, and most importantly, the vendors who still needed to be paid. Derek had been bragging for months about the lavish celebration they were planning, but I'd noticed the stress lines around his eyes lately, the way he'd started talking about minor budget adjustments and simplified decorations. Madison's father was covering the venue and catering, but Derek was responsible for flowers, photography, music, and a dozen other expenses that added up quickly. The wedding was 3 weeks away, and from what I could gather through casual questions and overheard phone conversations, Derek was struggling to cover his portion of the costs. His pride would never let him admit it, especially not to his waitress sister, but the signs were obvious to someone who'd spent years watching customers stress about money while trying to maintain appearances. I made a decision that surprised even me. Opening my business account, I began making payments to Derek's vendors. The florist, the photographer, the string quartet, the cake designer. One by one, I settled their outstanding balances and arranged for the remaining payments to be handled directly through Romano's catering account. By the time I was finished, I'd spent $43,000 on my brother's wedding. Not because I owed him anything, not because he deserved it, but because I loved him despite his casual cruelty, and because I wanted Madison to have the wedding of her dreams, even if her fiancé was too proud to ask for help. The next morning, Derek called me in a panic. "Sarah, something weird is happening. All my wedding vendors are saying their bills have been paid in full. The florist, the photographer, everyone. They won't tell me who paid them, just that everything's been settled." I made appropriate surprise noises while stirring cream into my coffee. That's strange. Maybe Madison's father decided to cover more than he originally planned? That's what I thought, but Madison asked him and he has no idea what's going on. He's actually kind of insulted that someone would pay bills he hadn't authorized. Derek's voice was tight with stress. What if it's some kind of mistake? What if they come after me for double payment? "I'm sure it will work itself out," I said calmly. "Maybe you have a secret benefactor." Derek laughed bitterly. "Right, like anyone in our family has that kind of money just lying around." The irony was delicious, but I kept my voice neutral. You never know. Sometimes people surprise you. The wedding day arrived with perfect weather and flawless execution. Madison looked stunning in her designer gown, Derek handsome in his custom tuxedo, and the Grandview Country Club had been transformed into something from a fairy tale. The flowers were more elaborate than planned. The photographer had brought an assistant for additional coverage, and the string quartet had been upgraded to a small orchestra, all because the vendors were feeling generous with a client whose bills had been paid so promptly and completely. I attended as Derek's sister, wearing a simple blue dress that had cost less than Madison's shoes but looked elegant in its simplicity. During the cocktail hour, I watched Derek and Madison pose for photos, their happiness genuine, despite the financial stress that had nearly overshadowed their celebration. "Beautiful wedding," said a familiar voice behind me. I turned to find James Morrison, camera in hand, taking a break between photo sessions. "It really is," I agreed. Derek and Madison both look so happy. James studied my face with the perceptive eye that made him such a successful photographer. "You know, the strangest thing happened with this wedding. Someone anonymously paid all the vendors' outstanding balances. $43,000. Just like that. The vendors are calling it the most generous gesture they've ever witnessed." I sipped my champagne and watched Derek spin Madison on the dance floor. That is strange. But wonderful too. It means they can just focus on celebrating instead of worrying about money. "Indeed," James said thoughtfully. "You know, I've been photographing weddings for 20 years, and I've learned that the most meaningful gifts are often the ones given without expectation of recognition or gratitude." During dinner, Derek stood to give a speech that brought tears to Madison's eyes and applause from the 200 guests. He talked about love conquering all obstacles, about the importance of family support, and about how grateful he was for everyone who'd helped make their dream wedding possible. Madison and I have been overwhelmed by the generosity of everyone here tonight, he said, his voice carrying across the elegant ballroom. Someone very special made sure that our day would be perfect, and while we don't know who you are, please know that your kindness will never be forgotten. I felt a stab of something. Not regret, exactly, but a complex mix of satisfaction and sadness. Derek was grateful for my gift, but he would never know it came from his just a waitress sister. The irony was almost too perfect. After dinner, as the dancing began and the celebration moved into full swing, Madison approached me at the bar where I was ordering another glass of champagne. "Sarah, I owe you an apology," she said, her cheeks flushed from wine and happiness. "I was condescending to you about the wedding planning, and that wasn't fair. Derek told me how hard you work, how you've always been there for him even when he doesn't appreciate it." I raised an eyebrow. "Did Derek actually say that?" Madison laughed. "Well, I may have read between the lines, but watching you tonight, seeing how graceful and elegant you are, I realize I made some unfair assumptions. You clearly understand sophistication and class. It's not about what job you have or how much money you make." "Thank you," I said simply. "That means a lot." As the evening wound down, Derek found me helping clear abandoned champagne glasses from cocktail tables. Old habits died hard, and I couldn't stand to see the catering staff overwhelmed. "Sarah, what are you doing? You're a guest tonight, not the help." I straightened, holding a tray of empty glasses. "Just trying to be useful. It's who I am." Derek's expression softened in a way I rarely saw. "I know I give you a hard time about your job, but honestly, I don't know how you do it. Working on your feet all day, dealing with difficult customers, managing all those details. I couldn't last a week." "It's not so bad," I said, thinking about the satisfaction I felt watching Romanos thrive under my leadership. I like taking care of people. I like being part of something that brings them joy. "Well, for what it's worth, you're really good at it. Madison's been raving about how professional and knowledgeable you were when we ate at Romano's last month. She said you knew more about wine than some sommeliers she's met." I felt a flush of pride that had nothing to do with the champagne. "I've learned a lot over the years." Derek hugged me then, something he hadn't done since we were children. "I love you, Sarah. I know I don't say it enough, and I know I can be a jerk sometimes. But you're my sister, and I'm proud of you." The words hit harder than his earlier dismissal. This was Derek, without his usual armor of superiority. Derek grateful and vulnerable, and temporarily free from the need to prove his worth through put-downs and comparisons. "I love you too," I said, meaning it despite everything. "And congratulations. Madison is perfect for you." 6 months later, Derek called with news that would have been shocking if I hadn't been expecting it. "Sarah, you're never going to believe this. Madison's pregnant, and her doctor says she needs to avoid alcohol completely, which means we need to cancel our anniversary dinner at Romano's. But here's the crazy part. When I called to cancel our reservation, they told me that someone had already covered it. Not just covered it, they've apparently been picking up our tab every time we've eaten there over the past year." I nearly choked on my coffee. I'd forgotten about that particular kindness, the way I'd quietly comped their meals whenever they dined at my restaurant. It seemed like such a small gesture compared to the wedding, but Derek's voice was filled with genuine bewilderment. "That's very strange," I managed. "Any idea who might be doing that?" "None whatsoever. Madison thinks we have a guardian angel. The restaurant won't give us any information about who's been paying, just that someone values our patronage enough to cover our expenses." I found myself smiling despite the complexity of the situation. "Maybe you do have a guardian angel." "Maybe," Derek said thoughtfully. "You know, it's made me think about how many people must be struggling financially without anyone knowing. How many people put on a good front while they're barely keeping their heads above water." The comment was surprisingly insightful for Derek, who'd always seemed oblivious to other people's financial realities. Perhaps becoming a father was already changing his perspective. "That's true," I said carefully. "You never really know what someone's situation is like behind closed doors." "Exactly. And here's the thing that's been bothering me. Whoever's been helping us knows we needed help, even though we never asked for it. That means they were paying attention, really seeing us, not just making assumptions based on appearances. I felt a strange tightness in my chest. Derek was describing exactly what I'd been doing, but he still had no idea that his waitress sister was capable of such generosity. Maybe that's the point, I said quietly. Maybe the best help comes from people who see what others miss. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Derek transformed from the self-absorbed man I'd grown up with into someone genuinely excited about becoming a father. He started talking about values he wanted to instill in his child, about the importance of treating everyone with respect regardless of their job or social status. I keep thinking about our mystery benefactor, he told me during one of our increasingly frequent phone conversations. Madison and I have decided that when the baby's old enough to understand, we want to teach them about anonymous kindness, about helping people without expecting recognition or gratitude. That's a beautiful lesson, I said, touched by his evolution. I've also been thinking about you, Derek continued, about how dismissive I've been of your work, how I've acted like serving people was somehow beneath our family. But you know what? You've chosen a profession that's all about taking care of others, about making their experiences better. That's actually pretty noble. I had to bite my lip to keep from crying. This was the brother I'd always hoped Derek could become, thoughtful, humble, grateful for the people who made his life better. Thank you for saying that. It means more than you know. When Derek and Madison's son was born, I sent flowers to the hospital with a card signed simply, "From someone who loves you both." Derek called to thank me for the beautiful arrangement, never suspecting that the someone was sitting 3 feet away from him during his visit. The flowers are gorgeous, Sarah, but that's not why I'm calling. The strangest thing happened again. The hospital told us that someone paid for our private room upgrade and all the additional services Madison wanted. We're talking about $8,000 in expenses that just disappeared. This time, I couldn't deny my involvement entirely. Maybe your guardian angel wanted to make sure Madison was comfortable during such an important time. But how would they even know we were having the baby? It's like someone's been watching over us, anticipating our needs before we even know we have them. I thought about the network of connections I'd built through Romanos, doctors who dined with us, nurses who worked private events, hospital administrators who trusted my catering recommendations. It hadn't been difficult to arrange for Derek and Madison's comfort during their hospital stay. Sometimes kindness has a way of multiplying, I said. Maybe you've been blessed by someone who understands what it means to struggle, even when you're trying to maintain appearances. Derek was quiet for a long moment. You know what's funny? All this anonymous generosity has made me realize how much I don't know about the people in my own life. I mean, someone close enough to know about our wedding, our restaurant visits, our baby, someone who cares enough to spend their own money making our lives better. And I have no idea who it is. Maybe that's the point, I suggested. Maybe the identity matters less than the intention. Maybe. But I keep thinking I should be paying more attention to the people around me. Really seeing them. Not just making assumptions based on what job they have or where they live. 2 years passed, and Derek's transformation continued. He started volunteering at a local food bank, bringing baby Henry along to teach him early about service to others. He stopped making dismissive comments about service workers and began treating restaurant staff with genuine respect and appreciation. The mysterious benefactor continued to appear at crucial moments. When Derek's car broke down and repairs would have strained their budget, an anonymous donor covered the costs through their mechanic. When Madison wanted to take art classes but couldn't justify the expense, someone quietly paid her tuition at the community college. Each act of kindness seemed to deepen Derek's appreciation for the hidden generosity that surrounded him. He started leaving larger tips for servers, donating to local charities, and looking for ways to help others without expecting recognition. I've been thinking, he told me during one of our Sunday dinners, where I watched him patiently help Henry navigate a plate of spaghetti. Whoever our guardian angel is, they've taught me something important about wealth. It's not about having money. It's about using whatever resources you have to make other people's lives better. I nearly dropped my fork. Derek had stumbled onto the exact philosophy that had guided my decision to keep working at Romano's despite owning it. to use my success to quietly help others, rather than loudly displaying my achievements. That's a wise perspective, I managed. And here's the thing. I realized I've been measuring success all wrong. I thought having money made me important, made me better than people who worked service jobs. But our guardian angel has shown me that the most important thing is how you choose to use whatever advantages you have. Derek paused, watching Henry attempt to twirl pasta on his fork with mixed success. I want Henry to grow up understanding that dignity comes from how you treat others, not from what job you have or how much money you make. I want him to see his Aunt Sarah as an example of someone who chose meaningful work over easy money. I felt tears threatening and took a sip of wine to compose myself. Derek, that's the nicest thing you've ever said to me. It's the truth. You've been working the same job for 15 years, because you love it, because you're good at it, because it lets you take care of people. That's not settling. That's choosing purpose over profit. If only he knew that I'd managed to have both purpose and profit. That my choice to remain visible in the restaurant had nothing to do with limited options, and everything to do with staying connected to the work and people I loved. The revelation came, as these things often do, through a child's innocent observation. Henry was 4 years old when Derek brought him to Romano's for dinner, a monthly tradition that had developed since the baby's birth. I was working the evening shift, as I often did on weekends, when Henry tugged on Derek's sleeve during dessert. "Daddy, why does Aunt Sarah have her name on that door?" Derek looked confused. "What door, buddy?" Henry pointed toward the back of the restaurant, where the office door was partially visible from their corner table. In small, discreet lettering, it read, S. Mitchell, owner. Derek's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and finally, stunned realization. He stared at me across the dining room, where I was taking an order at another table, then back at the door, then at me again. When I finished with my customers and approached their table, Derek was sitting in silence, his dessert untouched. "Everything okay?" I asked casually, though my heart was pounding. "Sarah," Derek said quietly, his voice strange and careful. Henry noticed something interesting. "Could you explain why your name is on the owner's door?" The moment I'd been both dreading and anticipating for years had finally arrived. There was no point in denying what Henry had observed with the clarity that only children possess. "Because I own Romano's," I said simply. "I have for 5 years now." Derek stared at me, his mouth opening and closing without sound. Madison, who'd been helping Henry with his gelato, went completely still. "You own this place," Derek repeated slowly. "This entire restaurant. The one where we've been eating for years. The one that's been covering our tabs." "All 3 locations, actually," I said, settling into the empty chair at their table. "And yes, I've been taking care of your meals, along with a few other things." "Other things?" Derek said faintly. "The wedding vendors, the hospital bills, the car repairs, and Madison's art classes, and the flowers when Henry was born, and about a dozen other expenses over the past few years." Derek put his head in his hands. When he looked up, his eyes were filled with tears. "You've been our guardian angel. My waitress sister, who I said couldn't possibly understand sophisticated financial planning, has been quietly managing our lives for years." "I wasn't managing your lives," I said gently. "I was just helping family when I could." Madison found her voice first. "Sarah, I don't understand. If you own 3 restaurants, if you have that kind of money, why do you still work tables?" It was a fair question, one I'd asked myself many times over the years. Because this is who I am. I built this business from the ground up, one table at a time. The customers, the staff, the daily rhythm of service. That's not something I wanted to give up just because I have an office upstairs. Derek was shaking his head slowly. "All those times I called you just a waitress. All those comments about your limitations, your inability to understand our world. And you were sitting there knowing you could buy and sell me 10 times over. It was never about the money, Derek, and I never wanted to buy and sell anyone. I wanted to take care of the people I love. But why didn't you tell me? Why let me go on being such an ass?" I considered the question carefully. "Because you needed to learn those lessons yourself. If I'd just written you a check or shown you my bank statements, You would have changed how you treated me, but not how you treated everyone else. You needed to discover that worth isn't measured by job titles or income levels. Derek was quiet for a long time, processing the magnitude of what he'd learned. Finally, he looked up with a rueful smile. So when I was bragging about my $200,000 wedding budget, you were probably thinking about what you spend on wine in a month. Something like that, I admitted. But Derek, your wedding was beautiful. Madison deserved that celebration, and you deserved to give it to her without stress. And you deserved to have a brother who respected you regardless of what job he thought you had. Henry, who'd been listening with the focused attention that children bring to adult conversations they don't quite understand, suddenly piped up. Aunt Sarah, does this mean you're rich? I laughed, the tension breaking slightly. It means I'm comfortable, sweetheart. But more importantly, it means I can help people I care about when they need it. Like how Mommy helps me when I can't reach something tall. Exactly like that. Derek reached across the table and took my hand. Sarah, I owe you an apology that's about 15 years overdue. I've spent so much time looking down on your choices that I never bothered to understand them. You weren't limited by your job. You were choosing to stay connected to work that gave your life meaning. And I owe you both honesty, I replied. I could have corrected your assumptions years ago. I chose not to, because I wanted you to respect service work and the people who do it, not just make an exception for me because I happen to own the business. Madison wiped away tears she'd been trying to hide. This explains so much. Why you always knew the perfect wine pairings, why the staff treated you like family, why you seem to have input on everything that happened here. They do treat me like family. I've worked alongside most of them for years. The money and ownership never changed the fact that I love this work and these people. Derek squeezed my hand tighter. Can you forgive me? Not just for the financial stuff, but for all of it. The condescension, the dismissiveness, the assumption that my path was somehow superior to yours. There's nothing to forgive, I said honestly. You've become exactly the man I always hoped you could be. The guardian angel thing just helped speed up the process. But there is something to forgive, Derek insisted. I spent years making you feel small because it made me feel big. That's not okay, regardless of what your bank account looks like. Henry, apparently bored with the adult emotional processing, had wandered over to the dessert display case. His absence gave us space for the more difficult conversation. Derek, I need you to understand something. The reason I could help you financially wasn't just because I own restaurants. It was because I've spent 15 years living below my means, saving aggressively, and making careful investments. I still drive my old Honda, I still live in my small apartment, I still shop at thrift stores. The money exists because I choose not to spend it on myself. Which makes your generosity even more meaningful, Madison said softly. You didn't help us with excess wealth. You helped us with money you'd saved through years of discipline and careful choices. And that's why I didn't want you to know, I explained. If you'd known I was wealthy, you might have expected help. This way, the help was freely given, not obligated or demanded. Derek nodded slowly. You gave us the gift of independence while secretly ensuring we'd never actually struggle. That's incredibly sophisticated, Sarah. More sophisticated than anything I've ever done. The conversation continued late into the evening, long after Henry had fallen asleep in the restaurant's comfortable booth and the other customers had gone home. We talked about money and family, about pride and assumptions, about the different ways people choose to measure success. I have one more question, Derek said as we finally prepared to leave. Now that I know the truth, what happens next? Do you want recognition for what you've done? Do you want to change how we interact? I considered the question carefully. I want exactly what we have right now. A relationship based on love and respect. Where you see me as someone worthy of consideration, regardless of my job title or bank balance. The money was never the point, Derek. The point was helping you become the person you were always capable of being. And what about the mysterious benefactor? Does that role end now that the secret's out? That depends on whether you still need a guardian angel, or whether you're ready to be one for someone else. Derek smiled, the same genuine expression I'd seen at his wedding, but deeper now, more self-aware. I think it's time I learned how to give instead of just receive. 6 months later, Derek and Madison established their own charitable foundation, focused on providing anonymous assistance to families facing financial crises. They used the same approach I'd developed, identifying needs quietly, helping without expectation of recognition, and creating space for dignity and independence. Henry, now old enough to understand the basics of their family's transformation, became their youngest volunteer, helping pack care packages and deliver anonymous gifts to families his parents had identified as needing support. He's learning early that wealth isn't about accumulation, Derek told me during one of our planning meetings for the foundation. It's about circulation. Money isn't meant to be hoarded. It's meant to be used to create opportunities and solve problems. I watched my brother coordinate with social workers and school counselors, developing systems to identify families who needed help without creating shame or dependence. The man who'd once dismissed me as just a waitress was now treating every person he met as potentially valuable, potentially wise, potentially deserving of respect, regardless of their circumstances. You know what the best part is? Derek said as we finished planning a back-to-school assistance program. I finally understand what you've known all along. The most rewarding work isn't about what you get. It's about what you give. As I drove home that evening, I thought about the journey we'd all taken from that moment in Derek's kitchen, when he'd dismissed my offer to help with his wedding planning. The Just a Waitress had paid for his entire celebration, but more importantly, she'd helped him discover that true sophistication lies not in what you own or what title you hold, but in how generously you treat the people around you. The laughter from that first dismissive comment had been transformed into something infinitely more valuable. The shared joy of a family that had learned to see past appearances to the heart of what really mattered. And sometimes, the greatest gift you can give someone isn't money. It's the opportunity to become the person they were always meant to be. The call came on a Tuesday morning while I was reviewing inventory reports in my office above Romano's. Derek's voice was tight with panic, something I hadn't heard since the early days of his wedding planning crisis. "Sarah, I need your help. Not financial help," he added quickly, "but your expertise. The foundation is in trouble." I set down my coffee and gave him my full attention. Over the past 2 years, Derek and Madison's charitable foundation had grown from a small family project into a significant operation, helping dozens of families navigate financial crises while maintaining their dignity. Derek had thrown himself into the work with the same intensity he'd once reserved for climbing corporate ladders. What kind of trouble? We're being audited by the state. Some reporter got wind of our anonymous giving and started asking questions about transparency and accountability. They're suggesting we might be a front for tax evasion or money laundering. His voice cracked slightly. "Sarah, we've been so careful to protect people's privacy that we don't have the kind of documentation they want to see." I understood the problem immediately. The foundation's strength, its ability to help people without creating shame or bureaucratic hurdles, was also its potential weakness from a regulatory standpoint. Anonymous giving, while noble, could look suspicious to investigators who didn't understand the motivation behind it. "Where are you right now?" "At the foundation office with Madison and our lawyer. We've got boxes of receipts and bank statements, but everything's organized around protecting recipient privacy rather than satisfying audit requirements." "I'll be right there." 20 minutes later, I walked into the cramped office space Derek had rented in a converted warehouse downtown. The contrast with Romano's polished elegance was stark. Folding tables, mismatched chairs, and filing cabinets that looked like they'd been rescued from a bankruptcy sale. But the walls were covered with thank you notes from families they'd helped, and the energy in the room spoke to the passionate commitment of everyone involved. Madison looked up from a laptop surrounded by scattered papers, her usually perfect appearance disheveled from stress. "Sarah, thank God you're here. I don't know how to organize all this information in a way that satisfies the auditors without compromising the people we've helped." Their lawyer, a young woman named Jennifer who looked like she'd been practicing for about 5 minutes, was frantically taking notes while speaking on the phone with someone from the state attorney general's office. "Walk me through your process," I said, settling into a folding chair next to Derek. "How do you identify families who need help, and how do you deliver that help?" Derek explained their system: referrals from school counselors and social workers, careful verification of need, anonymous payments made directly to vendors or service providers. It was a thoughtful approach that prioritized dignity and effectiveness, but it relied heavily on relationships and trust rather than formal documentation. The problem is that we've been treating this like a family helping other families, Madison said, pushing her hair back from her face. We didn't realize we needed to document everything like a government agency. Jennifer ended her phone call and turned to us with grim news. The audit team wants to see recipient files, vendor contracts, and detailed justification for every expenditure over the past 2 years. They're particularly concerned about payments that appear to circumvent normal charity protocols. I studied the chaos around me, thinking about my own experience building Romano's business systems. Derek, do you have access to all your bank records and canceled checks? Of course. Everything's been properly documented from a financial standpoint. And you have contact information for all the vendors you've worked with? Utility companies, landlords, medical providers? Yes. But we've been very careful not to identify the specific families we helped. The vendors know we paid bills, but not necessarily whose bills or why. I was beginning to see a solution. What if we could demonstrate impact without compromising privacy? Show the auditors that real families were helped, real needs were met, without revealing identifying information? Madison looked up hopefully. How would that work? Aggregate data. Instead of showing them Sarah Jones received rental assistance, you show them that 15 families avoided eviction. Instead of naming the children who received medical care, you document the number of emergency room visits prevented and prescription medications provided. Derek leaned forward, his business training finally clicking into gear. We could create case studies with identifying details removed. Show patterns of intervention and outcome without exposing individual families. Exactly. And we can get testimonials from the social workers and counselors who referred families to you. They can verify that real people were helped, without revealing who those people were. Jennifer was taking notes frantically. That could work. If we can demonstrate legitimate charitable impact while protecting beneficiary privacy, it addresses both the legal requirements and the Foundation's mission. The next several hours were spent reorganizing 2 years' worth of charitable activities into a coherent narrative that satisfied legal requirements, while honoring the Foundation's commitment to discretion. I found myself drawing on skills I'd developed managing Romano's, the ability to track multiple complex processes simultaneously, to identify patterns in seemingly chaotic data, and to present information in ways that told compelling stories. Sarah, Madison said during a brief coffee break, I'm watching you work, and I'm realizing we've been thinking about this all wrong. We've been treating the Foundation like a hobby that got bigger instead of like a business that happens to be charitable. She was right. Derek and Madison had approached their philanthropy with generous hearts but amateur management skills. They needed systems, protocols, and documentation practices that could scale with their ambitions. Would you consider consulting for us? Derek asked tentatively. Not as a favor to family, but as a professional arrangement. We need someone who understands both business operations and the service industry mindset. I looked around the cramped office, thinking about the parallel between this moment and my early days at Romano's. The potential was enormous, but it would require the same kind of systematic thinking and gradual professionalization that had transformed a struggling restaurant into a successful business. I might be able to help, I said carefully. But there would need to be some changes in how you operate. What kind of changes? Professional staff instead of family volunteers. Proper office space with adequate technology. Formal policies and procedures that protect both the Foundation and the people you serve. I paused, watching their reactions, and transparency about who's providing the leadership and expertise. Derek understood immediately. You mean no more hiding behind anonymity when it comes to Foundation management? Exactly. You can still provide anonymous assistance to families, but the Foundation itself needs to be transparent about its leadership, funding sources, and operational methods. Madison was nodding enthusiastically. We could move beyond just reactive help. With proper systems, we could develop programs that address root causes of financial instability. Prevention instead of just crisis intervention, Derek added. Financial literacy classes, job training partnerships, maybe even small business development loans. I felt the familiar excitement that came with recognizing untapped potential. You could become a model for how private philanthropy can complement public services without creating dependency or shame. Over the following weeks, as we worked to satisfy the audit requirements, the foundation began its transformation from a well-intentioned family project into a professional organization. Derek hired actual staff members with relevant experience. Madison enrolled in nonprofit management courses to formalize her understanding of charitable operations. They moved into proper office space and invested in technology that could track outcomes and measure impact. The audit concluded with a clean report and recommendations for best practices that actually strengthened the foundation's operations. More importantly, the investigation had forced them to articulate their mission and methods in ways that attracted attention from other philanthropists and nonprofit organizations. "We've got 3 major donors who want to contribute after reading our audit response," Derek told me during one of our weekly planning meetings. "And 2 universities want to study our model for protecting beneficiary dignity while maintaining accountability." The foundation's growth created new opportunities for collaboration with Romano's catering business. We began hosting fundraising events that showcased both organizations' capabilities, with the restaurant providing elegant settings for foundation donors to learn about the impact their contributions were making. One such event, 6 months after the audit crisis, brought together an unusual mix of guests: wealthy philanthropists, social workers, former foundation beneficiaries who'd agreed to share their stories anonymously, and local business leaders interested in supporting the foundation's work. I was working the event in my dual capacity as Romano's owner and foundation consultant, moving between the kitchen and the dining room, ensuring that every detail met our standards for excellence. During a quiet moment between courses, I found myself standing in the same spot where Derek had once dismissed my understanding of sophisticated event planning. "Excuse me, are you Sarah Mitchell?" The voice belonged to an elegant woman in her 60s, impeccably dressed and wearing the kind of jewelry that suggested serious wealth. "I am. Are you enjoying the evening?" "Very much. I'm Margaret Thornton from the Thornton Family Foundation. I wanted to thank you for the exceptional service tonight, but more importantly, I wanted to discuss your work with Derek's foundation." I recognized the name. The Thornton Foundation was one of the largest charitable organizations in the state, with a reputation for strategic philanthropy and innovative approaches to social problems. "What would you like to know?" "I've been studying the model you've helped them develop, and I'm fascinated by how you've balanced anonymity with accountability. We've struggled with similar challenges in our own giving." She paused, studying my face with sharp intelligence. "Derek mentioned that you're the one who developed their operational framework. I understand you have extensive experience in service industries?" "I own this restaurant and 2 others," I said simply. "But my background is in hospitality and customer service, which translates well to philanthropic work." Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly. "You own Romano's? I had no idea. Derek introduced you as their operational consultant." "I'm both. Just like I'm both the owner of this restaurant and someone who still enjoys working tables when needed." Fascinating. Margaret was clearly reassessing everything she thought she knew about the evening. "So when Derek talks about learning humility and service from his sister, the waitress, he's referring to someone who's built a successful business empire while choosing to remain connected to frontline service work. Something like that." Margaret smiled with the expression of someone who just solved a puzzle that had been bothering her. No wonder their foundation works so well. They learned from someone who understands both business excellence and genuine service. The conversation continued throughout the evening, and by the time the last guest departed, Margaret had made a proposal that would transform the foundation's scope and impact. "The Thornton Foundation wants to fund a national pilot program based on your model," she told Derek, Madison, and me during an impromptu planning session after the event. "We're talking about $2 million over 3 years to establish similar foundations in 5 other cities." Derek looked stunned. "You want to replicate what we've built here? We want to scale your approach to anonymous, dignified assistance while maintaining the operational excellence Sarah has helped you develop. But there's one condition." Madison leaned forward nervously. "What condition?" "Sarah has to be involved in training and supporting the new locations. Her combination of service industry expertise and business acumen appears to be essential to making this model work." I felt a familiar mixture of excitement and trepidation. The opportunity was extraordinary, but it would require a level of public visibility that I'd spent years avoiding. "I'd need to maintain my involvement with Romano's," I said carefully, The restaurants aren't just my business, they're my connection to the work that keeps me grounded. We wouldn't expect you to give up your primary business, Margaret assured me, but we would need you to formalize your consulting role and make yourself available for training and troubleshooting as we expand the program. Derek was grinning with the same expression he'd worn on his wedding day. Sarah, do you realize what this means? Your approach to anonymous giving could help thousands of families across the country. Our approach, I corrected. This only works because you and Madison were willing to learn, to change, to put the mission ahead of your egos. 6 months later, I found myself on a plane to Phoenix, heading to the launch event for the third foundation location in our pilot program. The past year had been a whirlwind of travel, training sessions, and system development as we worked to replicate the model we'd developed in our home city. Each new location brought unique challenges and opportunities. The foundation in Denver focused heavily on veteran families, drawing on connections with nearby military installations. The Atlanta location specialized in supporting immigrant families, navigating complex financial and legal systems. Phoenix was developing expertise in senior citizen advocacy, helping elderly residents on fixed incomes avoid financial exploitation. But the core principles remained constant: anonymous assistance that preserved dignity, systematic documentation that ensured accountability, and professional operations that could scale impact without losing personal touch. The most remarkable thing, Margaret told me during the flight to Phoenix, is how naturally the restaurant industry principles translate to charitable work. Customer service, quality control, efficient operations, team management. It's all directly applicable. She was right. My years of experience managing staff, controlling costs, maintaining standards, and creating positive experiences for diverse customers had prepared me for nonprofit consulting in ways that traditional business training might not have. The key insight, I replied, is that whether you're serving food or serving families in crisis, the fundamental goal is the same: meet people where they are, give them what they need, and help them leave feeling better than when they arrived. The Phoenix launch event was held at a boutique hotel, with local philanthropists, social workers, and community leaders gathered to learn about the new foundation's mission and methods. I stood at the back of the room, watching Derek present our model to an audience of strangers who were hearing about anonymous giving for the first time. The breakthrough came when we stopped thinking about charity as something we do for people, and started thinking about it as something we do with people, Derek was saying. When you preserve dignity and privacy, when you provide help without creating dependency, people can accept assistance and then become helpers themselves. He was describing exactly what had happened in our own family, how his experience receiving anonymous help had motivated him to become a giver, how understanding the recipient's perspective had made him a more effective philanthropist. After his presentation, a woman in the audience raised her hand. This all sounds wonderful in theory, but how do you ensure that people who receive help don't become dependent on it? How do you avoid creating a culture of entitlement? Derek smiled, and I could see him thinking about his own journey from entitled recipient to committed giver. The beauty of anonymous assistance is that people can't become dependent on something they can't identify or control. They receive help when they need it, but they can't manipulate the system because they don't know how it works. Meanwhile, the help is designed to solve immediate problems and create stability, not to provide ongoing support. And, added the local foundation director, a former social worker named Patricia, we track outcomes to ensure that our assistance actually helps people achieve independence, rather than just delaying crisis. The questions continued for another hour, with Derek, Patricia, and I sharing examples and best practices from our other locations. By the end of the evening, local donors had committed to funding the Phoenix Foundation for its first 2 years of operation. During the reception afterward, I found myself in conversation with Maria Santos, a school counselor who'd been working with at-risk families for 15 years. I have to tell you, Maria said, I was skeptical about this whole anonymous giving concept. It seemed too good to be true. But watching the presentation tonight, listening to the outcomes data from your other locations, I'm starting to think this could revolutionize how we help families in crisis. What convinced you? The dignity piece. I've seen so many good programs fail because they inadvertently humiliate the people they're trying to help. Forms, interviews, requirements, waiting periods, all the things that make sense from an administrative standpoint, but feel degrading when you're the one asking for help. She paused, studying my face with the perceptive attention that good counselors develop. Derek mentioned that you learned about service from working in restaurants. I'm curious about that connection. Think about how you feel when you walk into a really good restaurant, I said. The staff anticipates your needs, solves problems before you have to ask, makes you feel welcomed and valued. They don't make you fill out forms or justify why you deserve good service. They just provide it, professionally and graciously. And then you want to come back, and you want to tell other people about the experience. Exactly. Good service creates loyalty and positive word of mouth. Bad service, even when it's well-intentioned, drives people away and creates resentment. Maria nodded thoughtfully. So you're applying hospitality principles to charitable work. I'm applying human dignity principles to both hospitality and charitable work. The industry doesn't matter. What matters is treating people with respect and competence. The conversation continued late into the evening, with Maria and several other local service providers sharing stories about families who'd been helped or harmed by various charitable approaches. Their insights would be invaluable as the Phoenix Foundation developed its specific programs and protocols. Flying home the next day, I reflected on how far we'd all traveled from that moment in Derek's kitchen when he'd dismissed my understanding of sophisticated planning. The Just a Waitress was now consulting for foundations across the country, training nonprofit leaders, and helping develop a model that was being studied by universities and replicated by other philanthropic organizations. But more importantly, Derek had become the kind of person who understood that true sophistication lay not in dismissing others' perspectives, but in learning from them. He discovered that the most valuable expertise often came from unexpected sources, and that the best leaders were those who remained humble enough to keep learning. The plane touched down just as the dinner rush was beginning at Romano's. Instead of going home to rest after the traveling and presenting, I changed into my work clothes and joined the evening service. After hours of talking about service philosophy and operational excellence, I wanted to return to the simple, direct satisfaction of taking orders, making recommendations, and ensuring that every customer left our restaurant feeling cared for. "How was Phoenix?" asked Tony, one of our longtime servers, as we prepared for the evening rush. "Productive. We launched another foundation location, trained their staff, connected them with local resources." "That's great. But are you sure you don't want to just run everything from an office somewhere? You're becoming kind of famous in the nonprofit world." I smiled, tying my apron and checking my section assignments. "Tony, I own 3 restaurants, consult for charitable foundations in 5 cities, and have been featured in 2 national magazines this year. But you know what?" "What?" "This is still my favorite part of any day. Taking care of people, one table at a time, making sure they have what they need to enjoy their evening. Everything else is just an extension of this." As the evening progressed and the restaurant filled with families celebrating birthdays, couples on dates, and business associates closing deals, I moved through my familiar routine with deep satisfaction. Each order taken correctly, each wine recommendation appreciated, each small problem solved before it became a big one. This was the foundation that everything else was built on. Around 9 o'clock, Derek and Madison arrived with Henry, now 6 years old and wise beyond his years about both restaurant operations and charitable work. "Aunt Sarah!" Henry called out, running to hug me despite my apron and the tray of dishes I was carrying. "Daddy said you taught people in Phoenix how to help families without making them feel bad." "That's right, sweetheart. We showed them how to be helpful without being bossy." Henry nodded solemnly. "Like how you help people at the restaurant without making them feel stupid for not knowing about wine." Out of the mouths of babes. Henry had identified the core principle that connected all my work: competent assistance provided with genuine respect for the people being served. Exactly like that. As I seated Derek's family at their usual table and took their order, I marveled at how completely our relationship had transformed. The brother who'd once dismissed me as just a waitress now brought his son to the restaurant I owned, so the child could learn about service and excellence from his aunt, who chose to remain connected to frontline work. "You know what I realized in Phoenix?" Derek said as I brought their appetizers. "When I watch you work here, when I see how you interact with customers and staff, I understand why our foundation model works so well. You've spent 15 years perfecting the art of helping people without making them feel diminished. It's not an art, Derek. It's a skill that anyone can learn if they're willing to put the customer's dignity ahead of their own ego. Which is exactly what you taught us to do with foundation recipients. Henry looked up from his pasta. Daddy, does this mean Aunt Sarah is like a teacher? Derek smiled. Yes, buddy. Aunt Sarah is definitely a teacher. She just uses restaurants and charities instead of classrooms. As the evening wound down and the last customers departed, I helped with the closing routine while mentally reviewing the day's events. A successful foundation launch in Phoenix, productive conversations with local service providers, and a busy evening at Romano's with satisfied customers and efficient operations. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: a training session for the Denver Foundation staff, menu planning for Romano's spring offerings, and a conference call with Margaret about expanding the pilot program to include international locations. But tonight, I was simply Sarah Mitchell, owner and server at Romano's, member of a family that had learned to measure success by the lives we touched, rather than the recognition we received. The journey from just a waitress to nationally recognized consultant had been unexpected and occasionally overwhelming, but it had never required me to abandon the values and practices that made the work meaningful. The most important lesson we'd all learned was that true wealth wasn't about accumulating money or status. It was about developing the capacity to help others while preserving their dignity and your own authenticity. Whether you were serving food or serving families in crisis, the fundamental goal remained the same: leave people feeling better than when you found them. And sometimes, the most sophisticated thing you could do was choose to remain exactly who you were, regardless of how much your circumstances changed, or how many people finally understood your worth. The diagnosis came on a Thursday afternoon, delivered by Dr. Martinez in the same gentle tone she might use to discuss the weather. I sat in her office, still wearing my Romano's uniform after rushing from lunch service, trying to process words that seemed to belong in someone else's life. The good news is that we caught it early, she continued, studying the test results spread across her desk. Stage 1 breast cancer is highly treatable, especially with your overall health profile. The treatment protocol is well established, and your prognosis is excellent. I nodded, absorbing information that felt surreal and immediate at the same time. What does the treatment look like? Surgery first, followed by chemotherapy and radiation. We're looking at approximately 6 months of active treatment, during which you'll need to significantly reduce your activity level and avoid high-stress environments. 6 months. I thought about the foundation expansion project that was entering its critical phase, the new Romano's location scheduled to open in 8 weeks, the training programs I was committed to conducting in 3 different cities. The timing couldn't have been worse, which was probably the universe's way of forcing me to confront priorities I'd been avoiding. Doctor, I run several businesses and have consulting commitments across the country. How much of that will I need to step back from? Dr. Martinez gave me the look that medical professionals reserve for patients who clearly haven't grasped the seriousness of their situation. Sarah, chemotherapy isn't a minor inconvenience that you can work around. Your immune system will be compromised, your energy levels will fluctuate dramatically, and you'll need to focus entirely on healing. This isn't a time for business as usual. That evening, I sat in my small apartment, staring at the phone, and trying to figure out how to tell my family that the person they'd come to rely on for strength and solutions was about to need their help instead. The irony wasn't lost on me. After years of providing anonymous assistance to others, I was about to discover what it felt like to be on the receiving end of care and support. Derek answered on the second ring, his voice warm with the affection that had replaced his old condescension. Sarah, how did the consultation go? Did Dr. Martinez figure out why you've been so tired lately? I'd mentioned the fatigue to him weeks ago, attributing it to the increased travel schedule and long hours at the restaurant. None of us had suspected anything more serious than overwork and stress. Derek, I need to talk to you and Madison. Could you come over tonight? And maybe bring Henry. I'd like to tell him myself. Of course. Are you okay? You sound... I'm okay, but there are some things we need to discuss. An hour later, my brother sat on my small sofa, holding his son while Madison perched on the edge of my kitchen chair. They'd clearly prepared themselves for serious news, but I could see they weren't expecting what I was about to tell them. "I was diagnosed with breast cancer today," I said simply, watching their faces process the information. "It's early stage, very treatable, but the treatment is going to require some significant changes to my schedule and responsibilities." Derek's face went white. Madison gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Henry, too young to fully understand but sensitive to the adult's emotional shift, pressed closer to his father. "What does that mean?" Derek asked, his voice tight with controlled panic. "What kind of treatment? How long? What can we do?" I explained Dr. Martinez's recommendations, the timeline, the need to step back from many of my commitments. With each detail, I watched Derek's expression shift from shock to determination, the same look he'd worn when tackling the Foundation's audit crisis. "Okay," he said finally. "What do you need us to do?" "Derek, I'm going to need help with things I've never asked for help with before. The restaurants, the Foundation consulting, even basic daily tasks during the worst parts of treatment. I don't know how to be the person who needs care instead of providing it." Madison moved to sit beside me on the couch. "Sarah, you've been taking care of everyone else for years. It's time to let us take care of you. But the Foundation expansion project, the new restaurant opening, the training commitments will all be handled," Derek said firmly. "You've taught us how to run these operations. Now we're going to prove we learned the lessons." Henry, who'd been listening with the serious attention children bring to adult crises, suddenly spoke up. "Aunt Sarah, when I was sick with pneumonia, you made me soup and read me stories until I felt better. Can we do that for you?" The simplicity of his offer, soup and stories, cut through all my anxiety about business operations and professional responsibilities. This 6-year-old understood something about care that I'd forgotten in my focus on maintaining control and meeting commitments. "I would love that, Henry." Over the following weeks, as I prepared for surgery and arranged coverage for my various responsibilities, I discovered that the network of relationships I'd built through years of service was stronger and more reciprocal than I'd realized. The Romanos staff, who'd worked alongside me for years, seamlessly stepped up to cover management duties. Tony, the longtime server I'd trained personally, took over staff scheduling and vendor relations. Maria, our head chef, assumed responsibility for menu planning and kitchen operations. Together, they demonstrated that the restaurant's success had never depended on my constant presence but on the systems and culture we'd built collaboratively. The Foundation consulting work proved equally manageable with proper delegation. Derek and Madison divided my training responsibilities, using detailed materials I'd developed over the past 2 years. Margaret Thornton arranged for other experienced consultants to cover my travel commitments, while ensuring that my intellectual contributions continued through video conferences and detailed written guidance. "You know what's interesting?" Derek said as we reviewed transition plans the night before my surgery. "Watching how everyone's responding to your illness, I'm realizing that you've been training successors all along without announcing it. The restaurant staff, the Foundation teams, even Madison and me, we're all capable of carrying on your work because you taught us to understand the principles, not just follow procedures." He was right. My years of working alongside people, rather than simply managing them, had created a distributed leadership model that could function even without my direct involvement. The values and methods I'd developed were embedded in the organizations and relationships I'd built, making them resilient and sustainable. The surgery went smoothly, with Dr. Martinez successfully removing the tumor and confirming that the cancer hadn't spread beyond the original site. Recovery was more challenging than I'd anticipated, not because of physical pain, but because of the emotional difficulty of accepting help from people who'd grown accustomed to receiving it from me. Derek appointed himself my primary caregiver, arriving each morning with coffee and newspapers, staying to drive me to appointments, or simply providing company during the long hours when my energy was too low for normal activities. The role reversal was profound. My baby brother, who'd once dismissed my capabilities, was now managing my calendar and advocating for my needs with medical professionals. "Derek," I said one afternoon as he helped me organize medication schedules, "I owe you an apology." "For what?" "For not trusting you to handle things without me." for thinking that stepping back would somehow damage everything we'd built together. Derek paused in his organizing to study my face. Sarah, do you remember what you told me when I was panicking about the foundation audit? You said that the best systems are the ones that can function even when individual components fail or change. I remember. You built systems that could survive your temporary absence because you built them around principles and relationships, not personal control. The fact that everything's running smoothly while you recover isn't a sign that you're replaceable. It's proof that you're an exceptional leader. Chemotherapy brought different challenges. The fatigue was unlike anything I'd experienced, deeper and more persistent than the worst restaurant rushes or foundation crises. Some days, walking to the kitchen felt like climbing a mountain. Other days, I could barely stay awake long enough to eat the meals that Derek, Madison, and a rotating cast of friends brought to my apartment. Henry became my most frequent companion during treatment weeks, arriving after school with coloring books and simple games that matched my reduced energy levels. His presence was both comforting and instructive. He treated my illness as a temporary inconvenience rather than a fundamental change in who I was, maintaining the same easy affection he'd always shown. Aunt Sarah, he said one particularly difficult afternoon, when nausea had kept me in bed all day, Mommy says your medicine is making you feel yucky so it can make you better. Like when I had to take that awful-tasting antibiotic for my ear infection. That's exactly right, sweetheart. And when you're all better, will you still make the best spaghetti carbonara in the whole world? His question struck me as profoundly important. Henry wasn't asking whether I'd return to my business responsibilities or consulting commitments. He was asking whether the essential Sarah, the aunt who cooked his favorite dishes and taught him about kindness, would survive the treatment process. I will definitely still make carbonara, I promised. Maybe even better carbonara, because I'll appreciate it more. 3 months into treatment, Romano's hosted a fundraising dinner for cancer research, organized entirely by my staff, without my knowledge or input. I discovered the event when Derek mentioned it casually during one of his daily visits. Wait, what fundraising dinner? The one tomorrow night. Tony and Maria planned the whole thing. They've invited 200 guests, arranged for donated wines, created a special menu. All proceeds go to Dr. Martinez's research fund. I was simultaneously touched and slightly offended. They planned a major event without consulting me? Derek grinned. Sarah, they've been watching you plan events for years. They know how it's done, and they wanted to surprise you. Plus, Margaret Thornton is flying in to be the keynote speaker. The next evening, despite my ongoing fatigue and the wig that never quite felt natural, I attended the dinner in my honor. The transformed Romano's main dining room was elegant beyond anything we'd achieved for regular service, with candlelit tables, elaborate floral arrangements, and a string quartet performing in the corner. But what struck me most was the guest list. Cancer survivors and their families, foundation recipients who'd anonymously received help over the years, Romano's customers who'd become friends, foundation donors from 5 different cities, and staff members from all our restaurant locations. The room represented a community I'd helped build, but hadn't fully recognized until I saw it gathered in one place. Margaret Thornton's speech focused on the ripple effects of principled leadership, using my work as an example of how individual choices could create expanding circles of positive impact. But the moment that broke my composure came when Maria, our head chef, stood to present me with a cookbook. This contains recipes and stories from everyone whose life has been touched by Sarah's work, Maria announced. Restaurant customers, foundation families, staff members from all our locations, even some of the social workers and counselors who've partnered with our charitable efforts. Each recipe comes with a story about how Sarah's approach to service and dignity influenced their own lives. I opened the cookbook with shaking hands, reading entries that revealed the depth of connection I'd never fully understood. A customer who'd learned about wine through my recommendations and now hosted charity tastings. A foundation recipient who'd gone back to school and become a social worker. A former Romano's server who'd opened her own restaurant using principles she'd learned from watching my management style. The evening raised $47,000 for cancer research, but more importantly, it showed me that the most meaningful legacy wasn't the businesses I'd built or the consulting work I'd developed, It was the way I'd chosen to treat people during countless ordinary interactions, creating relationships that had grown into a community of mutual support and shared values. "You know what tonight proved?" Derek said as we drove home through the city streets. "It proved that you've been teaching people all along, whether you realized it or not. Every customer interaction, every staff training session, every foundation consultation. You've been showing people how to combine competence with compassion." By the time my treatment ended, 6 months after that first diagnosis, both my restaurants and foundation consulting work had not only survived but thrived under collaborative leadership. The Romano's staff had implemented several innovations that improved both efficiency and customer satisfaction. Derek and Madison had successfully launched 2 new foundation locations while maintaining quality standards at existing sites. Most importantly, I'd learned something about receiving care that complemented everything I'd known about providing it. The same principles that made charitable giving effective, preserving dignity, offering help without creating dependency, focusing on outcomes rather than recognition, applied equally to accepting assistance when you needed it. The hardest part, I told Dr. Martinez during my final treatment appointment, wasn't the physical side effects. It was learning to let other people take care of me without feeling like I was losing control or failing in my responsibilities. And what did you discover? That the people who truly care about you want to help because it gives their lives meaning, not because they expect something in return. Just like I've always felt about the work I do. Dr. Martinez smiled. "So you learned that receiving grace is as important as giving it." Something like that. The celebration dinner at Romano's was smaller and more intimate than the fundraising event months earlier. Just family and close friends, gathered around the large table in our private dining room, sharing stories and making plans for the future. Derek raised his glass for a toast. "To Sarah, who taught us that the most sophisticated thing you can do is choose service over status, principles over profit, and love over recognition. And who's now teaching us that strength sometimes means accepting help as gracefully as you give it." Henry, now 7 and wise beyond his years, added his own observation. "And to Aunt Sarah, who makes the best carbonara and always remembers to ask if people need extra cheese." The laughter that followed was different from any we'd shared as a family. It was deeper, more grateful, tempered by the awareness of how quickly circumstances could change and how precious ordinary moments really were. As the evening wound down and guests began to depart, I found myself alone in the restaurant kitchen, the same space where I'd spent countless hours learning the business that had become my life's work. The industrial equipment hummed quietly, cleaned, and ready for tomorrow's service. The walk-in cooler contained ingredients for meals that would bring comfort and celebration to hundreds of people over the weekend. But I was thinking about something larger than business operations or professional accomplishments. I was thinking about the community that had rallied around me during my illness, the network of relationships that had sustained both my businesses and my spirit through the most challenging period of my life. The journey from just a waitress to nationally recognized consultant had been remarkable, but the journey from someone who only gave help to someone who could also receive it had been transformational. I'd learned that true wealth wasn't just about having resources to share with others. It was about being part of a community where everyone had something valuable to contribute, where everyone deserved care and respect regardless of their circumstances. Derek found me in the kitchen, tidying unnecessarily while processing the evening's emotions. "You okay?" "More than okay, I'm grateful." "For what?" "For everything. The illness that taught me to accept help. The family that learned to give it. The businesses that survived without me. The community that cared enough to rally around someone they barely knew they loved." Derek leaned against the stainless steel counter, studying my face in the dim kitchen lighting. "You know what I think Grandfather would say if he could see us now?" "What?" "That his greatest gift wasn't the money he left us, or even the mission he inspired. It was the opportunity to discover that real family isn't about blood or inheritance. It's about choosing to take care of each other, especially when it's difficult or inconvenient." He was right. The legacy we'd built together, restaurants that treated every customer with dignity, foundations that helped families without shame, relationships that survived crisis and grew stronger through challenge. All of it had grown from the same simple choice: to see the best in people and help them find their way to their own best selves. Standing in the quiet kitchen where my professional life had begun 15 years earlier, Surrounded by evidence of everything we'd built together, I understood finally that the most important inheritance wasn't what you received from previous generations. It was what you chose to pass on to the next ones. And sometimes, the greatest gift you could give was learning to receive gifts gracefully, showing others that strength and vulnerability could coexist, that leaders and followers were often the same people in different moments, that the most meaningful success was always shared rather than achieved alone. The Just a Waitress had become many things over the years: business owner, consultant, mentor, patient, survivor. But the core remained unchanged, someone who believed that every person deserved to be treated with competence and compassion, whether they were ordering dinner or facing their darkest hour. That was a legacy worth building, worth preserving, and worth passing on to anyone wise enough to understand that true sophistication lay not in what you accumulated, but in how generously you shared whatever you had been given. 5 years after my recovery, the call that would change everything came from an unexpected source. I was reviewing quarterly reports in my office above Romano's when Jennifer Kim, our foundation's director of operations, knocked on my door with an expression that mixed excitement and apprehension. "Sarah, you need to see this email. It's from the Nobel Committee." I looked up from my financial spreadsheets, certain I'd misheard. "I'm sorry, what?" "The Nobel Peace Prize Committee. They want to nominate our foundation model for the upcoming Humanitarian Innovation Award. Apparently, our approach to dignified assistance has influenced policy changes in 12 countries. The email, printed on official letterhead and written in formal diplomatic language, invited us to present our work at an international conference on poverty alleviation in Oslo. The recognition was extraordinary, but as I read through the details, I felt a familiar unease about the level of attention it would bring. "Jennifer, this is incredible, but—" "There's more," she interrupted, clearly having saved the biggest news for last. "Amazon wants to fund a nationwide expansion of our model. They're offering $50 million to establish foundation locations in every major American city within 3 years." I set down the email and studied Jennifer's face. She was practically vibrating with excitement, but I could see she understood the complexity of what these opportunities represented. $50 million, I repeated slowly, to scale up from 5 locations to potentially 50 or more. The impact would be unprecedented, Sarah. We could help hundreds of thousands of families instead of thousands. We could influence national policy on charitable giving. We could lose everything that makes this work special, I finished quietly. Jennifer's enthusiasm dimmed slightly. "You're worried about the scale changing the nature of what we do. I'm worried about becoming exactly what we set out to replace. A large, bureaucratic organization that's more concerned with numbers and recognition than with the individual families we serve." That evening, I called an emergency family meeting at Romano's, using the same private dining room where we'd celebrated my recovery years earlier. Derek arrived with Madison and Henry, now 12 years old, and already showing signs of the thoughtful leadership that seemed to run in our transformed family. $50 million, Derek said after I'd explained the Amazon offer. "That's life-changing money, even for us." "But is it life-changing in a good way?" Madison asked, her nonprofit management training making her naturally cautious about rapid expansion. "We've seen what happens to organizations that grow too fast. They lose their mission focus and become focused on managing growth instead of serving people." Henry, who'd been listening quietly while sketching in his notebook, looked up with a question that cut to the heart of the matter. "Aunt Sarah, if we help more people but we can't help them as well, is that actually better?" Out of the mouths of babes again. My 12-year-old nephew had identified the central tension that every successful organization eventually faced: the choice between scale and quality, between broad impact and deep connection. "That's exactly the right question, Henry, and I'm not sure we can answer it without understanding what we might lose in the process." Derek leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "What if we approached this differently? What if, instead of accepting their money to expand our operations, we used our expertise to help them develop their own giving programs?" "You mean consulting instead of scaling?" "I mean teaching instead of growing. Amazon has resources we could never match, but they don't have our understanding of how to preserve dignity while providing assistance. We could train their corporate social responsibility teams, help them develop policies that reflect our principles." Madison was nodding enthusiastically. That way we maintain control over our existing operations while still multiplying our impact through their much larger platform. It was a brilliant suggestion, typical of the strategic thinking Derek had developed through years of foundation work. But I was thinking about something even more fundamental than organizational structure or funding mechanisms. Before we make any decisions about Amazon or the Nobel Committee, I said, I think we need to remember why we started this work in the first place. Derek, what was the original goal? Derek smiled, understanding immediately where I was headed. To help families in crisis while preserving their dignity and independence. And has that goal changed because we've become successful at achieving it? No. If anything, success should make us more committed to those principles, not less. Henry looked up from his notebook again. So the question isn't whether we should take the money. It's whether taking the money helps us do the work better, or just makes us more famous for doing it. I felt a surge of pride watching Henry engage with these complex issues. At 12, he already understood nuances about mission-driven work that some adults never grasped. More importantly, he'd absorbed the values we'd been modeling for years, putting purpose ahead of recognition, measuring success by impact rather than scale. Henry's right, I said. Fame and funding aren't inherently bad, but they're not the goal either. The goal is helping people. Over the following weeks, we developed a counterproposal for Amazon that reflected our commitment to principle over growth. Instead of accepting $50 million to expand our operations, we offered to design and implement a corporate giving program that would use Amazon's existing infrastructure and resources to provide dignified assistance to their employees and communities. The proposal was elegant in its simplicity. Amazon would fund emergency assistance programs in every city where they had significant operations, but the assistance would be provided through existing local organizations that we would train in our methods. Amazon's role would be financial and logistical. Our role would be educational and supervisory. It's brilliant, Margaret Thornton told me during a video conference about the proposal. You're leveraging their resources while maintaining your quality standards. And you're creating a sustainable model that doesn't depend on your organization's direct involvement? The Amazon executives were initially resistant, clearly having expected us to jump at the opportunity for massive expansion funding. But, after several presentations and site visits to our existing locations, they began to understand the wisdom of our approach. The thing that impressed us most, said David Chen, Amazon's Director of Corporate Social Responsibility, was watching your staff interact with foundation recipients. There's a level of respect and competence that we couldn't replicate just by throwing money at the problem. That's because respect and competence have to be learned and practiced, Derek explained during one of our training sessions for Amazon staff. You can't buy them or mandate them. They have to become part of organizational culture. The Nobel Committee presentation in Oslo was surreal in its formality and scope. I found myself on a panel with humanitarian leaders from around the world, discussing our foundation model in simultaneous translation for an audience that included government ministers, UN officials, and representatives from major international charities. The breakthrough was recognizing that dignity isn't a luxury to be added after basic needs are met, I explained to the assembly. Dignity is itself a basic need, and programs that ignore it often fail even when they're well-funded and well-intentioned. During the question period, a delegate from Bangladesh asked about cultural adaptation. Your model works in American contexts, but how do you ensure that it translates to different cultural settings where family structures and social expectations vary significantly? It was exactly the kind of question that reinforced my conviction about focusing on principles rather than procedures. The specific methods have to be adapted to local contexts, I replied, but the underlying principle, treating people with competence and respect, is universal. What changes is how you express that respect, not whether you provide it. The conference ended with our foundation model being cited as an example of scalable innovation that maintains human dignity at its center. The recognition was gratifying, but I was more interested in the conversations I'd had with practitioners from other countries who were already adapting our approaches to their own cultural contexts. Henry, who'd insisted on coming to Oslo despite missing a week of school, provided the most insightful observation about the entire experience. Aunt Sarah, he said as we walked through the Nobel Museum after the conference, I noticed that all the people who won peace prizes were famous for doing things, not for being important. Do you think that's why your work matters? Because it's about doing instead of being? What do you mean? Well, you could be famous for owning restaurants or consulting for big organizations, but instead you're getting recognized for actually helping people. The doing part, not the having part. I stopped walking and stared at my nephew, amazed by his insight. At 12, Henry had articulated something about leadership and recognition that many adults never understood. That meaningful achievement came from contribution, not accumulation. Henry, that might be the wisest thing anyone said about this whole experience. I learned it from watching you and Dad and Mom. You guys are always more excited about the people you've helped than about the awards you've won or the money you've made. The Oslo trip proved to be a turning point, not because of the recognition we received, but because of the clarity it provided about our future direction. We returned home committed to staying small and local while helping others replicate our model globally, consulting and training rather than expanding and franchising. Amazon's corporate giving program launched 6 months later, providing dignified emergency assistance to employees and community members in 43 cities. The program was administered by local organizations that we'd trained, funded by Amazon, and overseen by a small team of consultants that included Derek, Madison, and me. The impact was immediate and significant. Within the first year, over 15,000 families received assistance without bureaucratic hurdles or dignity-compromising requirements. More importantly, the program's success influenced Amazon's broader approach to corporate social responsibility, leading to policy changes that prioritized long-term community building over short-term charitable donations. The most interesting outcome, Margaret observed during one of our quarterly review meetings, is that Amazon's employees are now requesting to volunteer with the local organizations providing assistance. They want to be personally involved in the work, not just financially supportive of it. She was describing exactly what we'd hoped for, a model that created connection and community, rather than just transferring resources from those who had to those who needed. Romano's continued to thrive, with the original location serving as both a successful restaurant and an informal training center for hospitality professionals who wanted to learn about service-oriented management. We developed a reputation for producing staff members who went on to open their own restaurants or lead customer service initiatives at other organizations. It's like a graduate program in applied compassion, joked Maria, our head chef, who'd become something of a legend in local culinary circles for her combination of technical excellence and staff development skills. The description was more accurate than she probably realized. We had created something unique. A business environment where professional competence and human dignity were so thoroughly integrated that people couldn't learn one without developing the other. Standing in the restaurant that had grown from a place where I was just a waitress into something that taught the world about service and respect, I understood that the greatest revenge against dismissal wasn't proving your worth through wealth or recognition. It was building something so meaningful that it transformed not just your own life but the lives of everyone it touched. The laughter had stopped long ago. In its place was something infinitely more valuable. The quiet satisfaction of work that mattered, relationships built on mutual respect, and the knowledge that true sophistication lay not in what you accumulated, but in how generously you shared whatever you had been given. Some people measure success by the size of their bank account, or the recognition they receive. I measured it by the number of lives that were better because of the choice to see dignity in everyone, regardless of their job title or circumstances. The Just a Waitress had paid for more than her brother's wedding. She had paid it forward to an entire community, and the dividends would continue long after any individual story had ended. The end.